Look around you right now. What do you see? The seasons changing, people getting older, everyday objects slowly wearing out, right? We just naturally assume the universe is in this constant, nonstop state of movement. Well, what if I told you that every bit of that change, all of time and all movement, is actually nothing but a massive illusion? Today, we are meeting the ultimate disruptor in the history of philosophy, Parmenides. This is the guy who slammed the brakes on the very idea of change and claimed that our everyday senses are constantly, relentlessly lying to us. Welcome to the mind-bending world of the thinker who shook the roots of ancient Greek philosophy.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the conflict of being and becoming. Second, the two paths of inquiry. Third, the physical properties of being. Fourth, the great illusion of the senses. And finally, Parmenides' philosophical legacy.
Starting off with Section 1, the conflict of being and becoming. So, to really get why Parmenides was such a radical disruptor, we kind of have to set the stage first. Before him, early ancient Greek thinkers were totally obsessed with one massive question. What is the primary matter that underlies everything, and how exactly does it transform into all the endless variety of stuff we see around us? Their main focus was entirely on becoming and transformation. The absolute peak of this idea was Heraclitus. He argued that literally everything in the universe is in a constant state of flux, kind of like a burning fire. You've probably heard his famous line, "You cannot step into the same river twice." Well, Parmenides stepped onto the stage as a direct, aggressive counter to all of that. He essentially slammed his fist on the table and said, no, absolutely nothing changes. Change is fundamentally impossible. While Heraclitus was all about change, Parmenides anchored himself purely in constancy, stability, and the concept of being. Now, you might assume that a guy building this kind of ironclad, super strict logical argument would write some dry, boring essay, right? Nope, not at all. Parmenides delivered the most dense logical arguments in the history of philosophy through a literal mythological masterpiece, a poem simply titled On Nature. And he didn't even present these thoughts as his own ideas. Instead, he framed the whole thing as a divine revelation. He claimed it was delivered to him during this epic cosmic journey where the daughters of the sun drove a chariot straight up into the heavens. In this poem, Parmenides is greeted by the goddess of justice, Dike, and she's the one who delivers the ultimate truth. She commands him to split the universe into two totally distinct realms. On one side, you have the unshaken heart of absolute truth, which can only be grasped by pure reason. On the other side, the deceptive opinions of mortals, basically baseless assumptions driven by our easily fooled senses. It was a brilliant move, honestly. Parmenides gave his incredibly strict logic this undeniable mythological authority. Let's move on and see how this builds in Section 2, Two Paths of Inquiry. So the goddess lays out a map of human thought for Parmenides. She's showing him the fundamental logical paths we can take when we're searching for the truth. Let's do a quick thought experiment together right now. I want you to try and picture absolute nothingness in your mind. And to be clear, not an empty room and not the dark vacuum of space, because those are actually still things. Can you actually think of that which entirely, completely does not exist? If you're being honest, the answer is no. Your mind always has to latch onto a thing. And from that little experiment, Parmenides extracts this massive, completely inescapable logical equation. To think and to be are one and the same. If you can think about something, if you can speak about it, that thing has to exist. You literally cannot think about or utter a concept of something that doesn't exist. You cannot think of nothing. Therefore, according to Parmenides, the most fundamental rule of logic is this: nothingness, or the void, simply does not exist, period. He breaks all of this down into three strict logical paths. Path 1 is the path of truth. Being is. Path 2 is a complete dead end. Non-being is not. Since he just proved you can't even conceive of non-being, that path is obviously impossible. But Path 3. Path 3 is the one that everyday mortals walk. Being both is and is not. This path assumes things exist, then they don't, and that there's this empty space where things move around. To Parmenides, this third path is just one giant logical contradiction. If nothingness doesn't exist, how on earth can something pass from non-being into being, or drop from being into non-being? It makes no sense. So, what is the result of all this? Let's hit Section 3, the physical properties of being. Now, what's really interesting about this is what happens when we completely rip the concept of nothingness, or a void, out of the universe. Parmenides doesn't just say, being is, and drop the mic. Using absolutely zero experimental observation, relying entirely on pure reason, he deduces exactly what this being has to look like. Think about it. If there is no empty space, there's literally nothing to get between objects and separate them. Therefore, being is one. It cannot have parts, because there's no void to divide those parts, so it's indivisible and totally continuous. And here's the real kicker. It's unchanging. Because change implies moving into a state that didn't exist before, gaining some new quality from nothingness. But since nothingness isn't real, there is no past, there is no future. Being is just an eternal, solid block. When he pushes this strict deduction to its absolute logical limit, he gives us a visual that completely shatters our common sense. Reality, being itself, is a perfect, finite, and completely round sphere. It lacks nothing, it contains absolutely zero empty space, it's perfectly balanced, and it is entirely motionless. This is his ultimate unshakable photograph of the universe, drawn up by pure reason. Which naturally brings us to section 4, the great illusion of the senses. Because at this point, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, I'm moving my hands right now. I see people walking around outside. As I drink my coffee, I literally watch the liquid go down in the mug. That is clearly change. If reality is just some motionless sphere, what are we supposed to make of all these vibrant, everyday experiences? Well, Parmenides' answer to this is incredibly sharp, and honestly, pretty bold. For him, there is zero compromise between reason and the senses. It is a strict A/B binary. Reason gives us the eternal truth, the absolute necessary conclusion of logic. But our eyes, our ears, our sense of touch, they give us nothing but opinions. They lie to us. If your eyes show you change in movement, you shouldn't trust your eyes. You have to trust your reason. Basically, our entire sensory world is just a massive, persistent hallucination. And this brilliantly illustrates our final part, Section 5, Parmenides' philosophical legacy. Parmenides wasn't just another smart guy in ancient Greece. He was this massive turning point who completely rewrote the rules of philosophy. His strict logical framework was so convincing and notoriously difficult to defeat that he essentially broke all the Greek philosophy that came after him. Later philosophical heavyweights couldn't logically refute his core argument that nothing comes from nothing and what exists cannot be destroyed. They found his logic so terrifyingly sound that instead of defeating him, they had to invent wildly creative ways just to work around him. It's actually kind of funny. You can see how all these later philosophers essentially had to cheat his rules just to allow change to exist. Empedocles accepted that being couldn't be created or destroyed, but instead of one sphere, he split it into 4 elements. So change was just those eternal elements mixing together. Democritus took the idea of an indivisible, unchanging being, shrank it down to microscopic sizes called atoms, and then actually invented Parmenides' most hated concept, the void, just so those atoms had room to bounce around. Plato took Parmenides' unchanging, perfect being and shoved it way up into the heavens as the world of ideas, declaring that our physical world is just a corrupted copy. Every single one of them had to multiply or divide being just to make sense of the universe. So when you really sit with it, Parmenides stops being just some dusty historical figure. He leaves us with this brilliant challenge to confront our own minds. Think about modern discoveries in quantum physics that constantly tear down our common sense notions of space, time, and matter. The question Parmenides asked 2,500 years ago is just as relevant today. If our senses inherently lie to us about change, time, and space, how much of the modern reality you experience every single day, the reality you are so absolutely certain of, is actual truth, and how much is just an opinion generated by your mind? Keep questioning everything, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.